Northern Highlands, Bethel, 1995.
I hate these stories.
But your fans love them, said Adam. Won't kill you to do 1 or 2 every 6 months. Celeste shrugged.
It might kill me.
She drained the last of her coffee and stepped up onto the mound of unremarkable bedrock. Her imagination wasn't up to par with the cavers, so she couldn't see anything beyond these old, sand-colored bricks. It had been the center of the old town in the 50s. More notably, it was a stronghold like many others that littered the Scottish Highlands. Just in front of her was a ruined church where, just 11 years before, youngsters Bruce Monroe and Judy Crabtree thought getting matching Ghostbusters tattoos was the first day of the rest of their lives. Like the decayed fort, Celeste only saw the ruin, and the hole was just that. A square, darkened void cut right into the hillside. She had a passing interest in this place because of its long, illustrious history. This site was a local legend, and even though she didn't want to be here, she still intended to sell her performance. She was a professional actress, after all. Joining the story was her cameraman, Ronan Keats, and local explorer and historian, David Hamilton. Both men looked geared to handle the Arctic tundra. Celeste was wearing her best boots, her best coat, and a pink helmet with a mounted halogen light that the network bought just for the occasion. BBC One/Scotland was etched in bold blue letters across the side. She looked professional enough, and that's what mattered. As long as a reporter could talk the talk, people would believe the fiction. Adam, BBC One producer, stepped up to the mound and looked into the hole. He may as well have been staring into outer space. The entrance was tall enough that anyone could walk right in without stooping, and wide enough that the entire Channel 1 van could drive through. "It doesn't look like much," he said, and he picked up a stone and tossed it in. There was no sound. The void had devoured it.
"And it may not be much,"
said David.
"I've never been inside, and I don't know anyone else who has."
We're just going in a tiny bit, yeah,
said Celeste.
Just enough to make the viewers curious.
"Aye,"
said Ronan, checking the spare battery before shoving it into his vest pocket.
"I hate bats. I don't want no bats in my hair."
Celeste shuddered to think. She wanted to put her frizzy blonde locks in a fishnet, but decided against it. The fan mail mentioned her hair most of all.
"We ready?"
she asked, looking at her watch. This would be a quick segment, just a 3-minute sizzler to take tonight's broadcast into break. She was thankful they weren't going live. She wasn't sure how the fear would come through her voice. "Wait," said Adam, just as David entered the hole. Ronan flashed a look back to Celeste and realized their producer wanted a moment with her, so he put his camera across his shoulder and followed their historian into the void. Celeste came back and stood on the uneven mound with her husband of 6 years. They'd only gone public 6 months ago.
"Yes?"
"Watch out for cave lice," he said in a stern voice.
"What? Is that a real thing?"
She brought her hands up and scratched her scalp, but the budding smile on his face told her it was all a ruse.
"You're a real arse, you know that. Worse than Nathan."
Her little brother loved playing tricks.
"I know,
but we needed Celeste O'Connor's signature smile again, yeah? Now, go find us some skeletons."
"Very funny,"
she said, and kissed him full on the lips. She stepped up to the hole's entrance. Then she looked back at him and grinned through an uneasy feeling that they both hated for the remainder of their days. His days would end in another 12 years. Hers would end in 7 minutes. Adam watched as the video feed flickered to life. He'd retreated to the van so that he could load a cassette into the VCR and record the footage. Ronan's camera was corded, but he was running off a spool that stretched for 100 meters. The camera's harsh white light filled the narrow corridor. Celeste, in her porcelain beauty, squinted, her pupils growing small. She was wearing a lavalier microphone clipped to her jacket, and the sound came across tinny and full of static until both Ronan and Adam made adjustments. When they were ready to go, Celeste stood up straight and assumed her practiced newscaster stance.
Hello, I'm Celeste O'Connor for BBC One, Eyes on Scotland. I'm coming to you from Under Bethel, where I'm joined by David Hamilton, local historian. David, can you tell us what we're doing here today?
David was a quiet, reserved man with intelligent eyes. His argyle sweater made him look more at home at a university classroom than underground in a mysterious cave. He stepped up to Celeste and focused on the camera, although his eyes kept averting down.
Yes, Mum. We are standing just below the ancient stronghold of the MacEwen clan. The site dates back several centuries.
Right, and why is it called Bethel?
Bethel was the name of the town that sprouted up in the 1950s. We're just beneath the old church.
There wasn't much of that now, Adam noted. The buildings were all in ruins, many of them burnt husks.
And what happened to Bethel?
David's tone turned grim.
All the people disappeared. Over 100 of them.
Any ideas what may have happened?
Asked Celeste, her reporter's voice emphasizing great concern. He shook his head.
No, Mum. But the prevailing belief is that they disappeared into this very cave. It's happened a few times since then.
Celeste turned back to the camera.
You might remember that 8 Russian athletes were training in the Highlands for the '88 Olympics.
Aye,
said David.
Disappeared off the face of the map. And then there was a backpacker in the 70s and those kids in the 80s. Bethel has swallowed up quite a few unfortunates.
So what happened? Do you think this place is evil?
At that, David laughed, but he ran nervous fingers through his long, unkempt hair.
Nonsense. If I had to guess, I would say this cave goes on for miles. People are curious, they wander, and they get lost. We may find them yet.
Oh, hear that? A BBC One exclusive. Let's go a little deeper, shall we?
Adam watched Ronan turn the camera to a long, square hallway. None of it looked natural. Not that he thought it would. The Highland clans were notorious treasure hoarders. It made perfect sense they'd hollow out the earth to hide their spoils. It was naturally dark inside, but something about this place swallowed the light. Ronan twice had to stop and tap his bulb, and Celeste's own halogen headlamp flickered. Once this happened in sync, and it was terrifying to see how completely wrapped in the darkness the group had become. David let his torch's beam take in all corners with great interest. Each of them kept an eye trained on the ground because he'd briefed them on cave safety. They could lose their footing and roll to their deaths should the cave have cliffs. Ronan kept pulling the slack wire behind him, and each time he jerked, the camera moved up and caught the ceiling. It was all worked, as if dozens of Scottish hands had chiseled away until it was smooth.
Look,
said David, voice echoing.
Stairs.
Ronan moved up to stand next to his companions, the light spilling across at least 20 wide, perfect steps. They descended sharply, and the light couldn't reach the bottom of them. Celeste held on to David as he led her down. The echo was tremendous, and each time Ronan pulled the slack and the camera tilted up, the darkness swallowed the light. This section of the cave was large, and he felt a chill run up his spine. Something about this place was foreboding, and he wasn't even walking its silent, tomb-like halls with the others.
Should we go back?
Celeste said and giggled. She made it sound half-hearted, but Adam had known her long enough to tell she was terrified. At that moment, she would have run from that place if the men agreed.
Wait.
David stopped near the bottom of the steps.
Look at that.
They could hear water dripping and the echo of their feet against the steps. Celeste ran fingers through her hair, convinced that there were tiny bugs crawling about. But David wasn't concerned. His light shined on a massive column that marked the boundary of a large chamber.
Do you recognize this? He said. The design, I mean.
Ronan moved the camera up and down, recording the recesses along the column. Large curling scrollwork tipped the ends. Across the doorway stood another one. Both columns were probably 5 meters tall and had been carved right into the rock.
"Something about this doesn't look right,"
said the cameraman.
"I remember enough history to know this isn't from the clans." "No,"
said David.
"This is an ionic column."
Celeste breathed a nervous laugh to the camera.
Tell our viewers at home what that means."
"It means it's an ancient Greek design, and there's no reason it should be in the Scottish Highlands." "A joke, probably," said Ronan. "The people who came in here over the years probably carved it out, right?"
David shrugged, still moving his light across the column.
"It's possible, I suppose, but this would be hard to do without equipment."
"Why?"
asked Celeste. He pointed his light to the bottom of the left column. Just beneath it was a chasm.
"This would require caving equipment, ascenders and foothold drills. Bolts, probably. There's no holes in the rock. Whoever carved these things did them the old-fashioned way."
Adam could tell that Celeste was visibly shaken, and when her body went rigid, he knew it was probably time to end the segment. They had a good story. The columns would be interesting enough.
"Guys, let's wrap,"
he called on the radio. Ronan pushed the button on his collar and acknowledged, but Adam barely understood through the static.
"Just a bit further,"
said David, and without waiting for either of them to agree, he headed off toward the columns and the massive doorway in between. The darkness surrounded him, as if he'd never even been there. Crossing this threshold seemed unwise.
"Stick close,"
said Ronan, and he started forward, still angling the camera up every dozen steps so that he could pull the slack.
"Hey guys, I think we have enough footage,"
said Adam.
"How about we turn around?"
Again, Ronan answered on the radio, but his words were lost in a sea of static. Adam said,
"Ronan, if you can hear me, just reply into Celeste's mic."
Radio transmissions were lost in the cave, but he could still hear and see clearly with the camera. After all, it was wired to the van. But Ronan said nothing else, and Adam feared they'd lost communication. He tried to raise the cameraman 3 more times, but never got a response. He could hear Celeste's heavy breathing through her mic. Again, Ronan pulled the slack, and this time, when the camera angled to the high ceiling between the columns, Adam caught sight of something moving, creeping silently across the rock. It was large, black, and the camera's light reflected off its shiny surface. Ronan pulled on the slack again, and this time the shape was gone.
"Celeste? Ronan?"
said Adam, voice rising.
"Guys, turn around and get the hell out of there. Now."
He tried to keep his words level and calm, but it was hard. And then Celeste turned as if she was about to say something, as if she were about to suggest they leave their guide and get out. Her eyes found the camera's light, and then she was looking past it, past Ronan, and she screamed. A blood-curdling wail that Adam heard both on camera and from the recesses of the hole. The feed he'd been watching was suddenly ripped away as the whole monitor violently jerked from the shelf and tumbled outside. Adam chased after it, leaping from the van and wrapping his fingers around the coaxial cable. Something powerful was pulling it into the hole, and he dug in his heels to keep from going along. It was like 3 men beyond the dark were playing tug-of-war. Adam's feet planted firmly on the entrance to the hole, and he almost lost his footing when he heard his wife scream out again. A male voice joined in, although he couldn't tell if it was Ronan or David. And then Adam fell back, the cord suddenly slack. He bounded up to his knees and reeled it in hand over hand, wanting to cry because he knew by the weight there wasn't anything attached to the other end. Not even the camera, so certainly not his friends. But he wasn't expecting the cord to be wet as the final frayed end made it to his hands. He looked at his fingers, and they were covered in blood. Adam threw the cord aside and emptied his breakfast in the nearby dead shrubs. He radioed emergency services from the van's dash. Way out in the highlands, the nearest town to Bethel was Inverness, but he got lucky. A pair of response officers were tending to a trash can fire a few kilometers east and arrived on the scene 10 minutes after he'd heard Celeste's last screams. After explaining what had happened, both response officers, who identified themselves as Thackett and Maxwell, pulled a pair of road flares from their trunk and bravely entered the hole. Adam sat in the dirt near the entrance and watched their flickering, hissing lights disappear. It grew quiet for a few minutes, and then an explosion of more screams. He stood and backed away toward the van, wishing he was brave enough to venture inside, but knew he wasn't. Gunshots punctuated the screams. 4 loud pops sent chills down his spine each time he heard them. Adam was about to step toward the hole when a shape suddenly filled the doorway. Maxwell came running, but he tripped over the threshold. Adam moved to help him up, but the officer's frantic look kept him in place. There was a trickle of blood on the side of his head. He reached a trembling hand for help, but before Adam could save him, something pulled him back into the darkness, and Bethel claimed its 227th victim.